Welcome back to our study of Africa. Today we're going to be taking a little bit of a shorter lecture, and you'll be spending some time doing some research into the Portuguese exploration of Africa. Now, this is something that I don't think I was aware of clearly until I took a class in college talking about the connections the Atlantic gave to the continents of Europe, Africa, South America, and North America. And that book started with the following of the Portuguese in their exploration of the African coast. And it's something that I want to give you guys some illumination on, and some understanding on that I definitely did not have when I was in high school. It really helped me understand the beginnings of one of the biggest migrations in human history. And that, of course, is the migration of African slaves across the Atlantic into the New World, which is going to be the topic of our next lecture. But I think it would be best if we had some background information, some background understanding of what is going on with that stuff. And so to do so, we're going to talk about the Portuguese exploration of Africa. Now, Europeans, as we've previously mentioned, had a really pretty significant ignorance about what Africa was like south of the Sahara. Remember, the Sahara Desert proved to be a formidable barrier. The only real way to connect Europe to Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa more correctly, is the Islamic trade routes that connected the Middle East to West Africa. Remember, we talked about those connections. The only way for a European to see Africa would have been to travel along those very trade routes. And to say the least, that would have been unlikely, if not impossible. Of course, we can't say definitively that no European ever did it, but I think it would be unlikely for any European to have seen it and come back and spread that information. Most Europeans were in the dark. That being said, by the 1450s, you're probably familiar with the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula. And remember, the Reconquista is the process by which the Spanish and the people that would become the Portuguese drove out the Muslim rulers of their land. And eventually that process ended in 1492 when Ferdinand and Isabella took the last Muslim stronghold in Spain and drove the Muslims out entirely. So Reconquista is kind of this idea of reconquering. It starts all the way back in the late 700s AD and continues until that 1492 date. Now, Portugal drove the Muslims out of their territory much earlier than the Spanish did. And the reason for this, of course, is because Portugal had less territory to fight over. So it does make sense that they were able to win this victory earlier. And it was not as closely connected to northern Africa, unlike the southern parts of Spain, which, if you're familiar with the geography there, and if you're not, look it up on your Chromebook, there's a very small space of water between southern Spain and northern Africa. Portugal, on the other hand, is much further away. So the Muslims were less able to support themselves. And so the Portuguese were able to drive them out. The Portuguese then had resources and time to spend on other things. And the main thing that the Portuguese spent their resources on were naval explorations. Now, why would they want to explore and use their ships to explore? Well, actually, the reason for this is very simple, and it's what motivates many humans to do many things, and that is money. As Portugal looked at the surrounding groups, at the surrounding nations, if you want to call them nations, they weren't really nations quite yet. But as they looked around, they saw the wealthiest societies were primarily in the Mediterranean, and the way that they made their money was through very, very lucrative trade routes. And the most famous of these cities is Venice, okay, in Italy. But we also actually have several other important cities in Italy that had these important trade connections. Cities like Genoa, cities like Pisa, that had connections actually to the Middle East. They would trade with the Muslims, and they would take Muslim goods and they would sell them in Europe. And of course, the Muslims were trading as far away as China. So this is kind of the connection between the East and the West. And we've talked about the Silk Road in the past. This is just the 13th, 14th century version of that, goods going from China to Western Europe. Now, the Portuguese took that model and said, how can we get into this? Because they didn't have the military muscle to force the Italian city-states out of that carrying trade between the Muslims and Europe, at least not in the Mediterranean. And so the Portuguese instead thought to themselves, perhaps there's some other way to access the Muslim traders, or perhaps there's some way to access heretofore undiscovered lands that are just as rich as wherever the Muslims are investigating. And so the Portuguese decided to go in the only real direction available to them, and that was south along the coast of Africa. And if we think about where Portugal is, it can't really go to the north. That land was known to it. England and Ireland and Iceland are all places that the Portuguese would have been familiar with. And in fact, this surprises people a lot of times. Christopher Columbus probably actually traveled to Iceland once, and he was working for the Portuguese at that time. So there is some familiarity with these northern areas, but there's really nothing of trade value up there that had not already been discovered. And so the Portuguese are forced to go south. Now, this is difficult because the way that the wind system in the Atlantic works is there is almost always a wind that blows south from the England, UK area and goes to the American East Coast. It then goes down to the Caribbean, where the warm water and the warm air heats it up, and it comes back across the Atlantic at the middle latitudes, and it blows up north the coast of Africa and kind of blows into Spain and Portugal from there, meaning to sail south across down the coast of Africa was extremely difficult. You effectively had to sail straight into the wind. And if you've ever seen a sailboat or been on a sailboat, you'll know that that is a difficult task. Now, if you have been on a modern sailboat, you might think to yourself, well, it is possible to sail into the wind directly or almost directly. You just need to have a slight angle and you can actually still make forward progress. Well, actually, that technological innovation was invented by the Portuguese for exactly this problem. At first, the Portuguese tried several different strategies. The most obvious and most horribly impractical was rowing. But this was not like ancient times where you had hundreds of people you could use as slaves to row. This was not efficient at all. In fact, rowing full speed, you could only make a few miles a day. And again, remember, the Sahara is monstrous. It would take you probably months to row from the last fertile areas of Morocco, modern day Morocco, of course, all the way down to the areas where you could again find water in Senegal and places like that. And this would have simply been impossible. You can't possibly carry enough fresh water to make the trip. So really the Portuguese were limited until they could figure out some way to sail straight into the wind. And eventually they did this. It takes them almost 200 years of experimentation, but they develop a new type of sail and a new type of ship construction that they name the caravel. And this ship is very, very efficient. It's very aerodynamic. It flows well. The water flows well around it. And it has this peculiar sail system using a number of odd triangular sails that can actually harness the wind, and it can actually propel a ship forward even when the wind is blowing directly into the sails from the front. And this allows the Portuguese to push past the Sahara Desert and down into what we would call West Africa. Now, when the Portuguese arrived, they really had an odd experience because, first off, interestingly enough, they bumped into people who spoke Arabic. And again, the reason for this is because of the contact between West Africa and the Middle East. The language of Islam was transmitted, and the only language that Islam can really be done in is Arabic. There's no translations of the Quran. You can't read the Quran in another language other than Arabic. And you might have seen some translations of one of the surahs of the Quran. In the Muslim faith, that is not actually the word of God. It only counts as the word of God if you literally physically have the Arabic in your hands and you're reading that. So many people in West Africa were at least generally familiar with Arabic. And of course, the Portuguese, having thrown off the Muslims a few hundred years beforehand, also had a general familiarity with the Arabic language, enough that they could establish a very basic level of communication. And the Portuguese offered the Africans trade, and the Africans accepted, and the two groups were primarily trading the two things that were most valuable to them that the other possessed. The Africans possessed what to the Portuguese was a almost unlimited amount of gold, and the Africans were primarily buying from the Portuguese two products, firearms and alcohol, which the Europeans were much better at making than the Africans. The Europeans had the technology of distilling, which enables you to produce alcohols that can last for long periods of time. So this is the initial trade. This begins in the the 1450s. In fact, I think it begins in 1452 specifically. We can kind of put a date on that. And the Portuguese begin to push further and further south. But as I've mentioned in other lectures, there are several problems for the Portuguese. Number one, sub-Saharan Africa has a huge number of diseases. And the native African population, of course, through natural selection, has adapted to these diseases. And they have a number of defenses. They're very hardy when it comes to these diseases. And the Europeans really had not experienced them at all. In fact, we have a reverse process of what we had in the Americas with the arrival of the Europeans and their diseases killing off millions and millions of Native Americans. Instead, we have the exact reverse process. When the Europeans land in Africa, the African diseases actually kill them off and make settling in Africa not just difficult, but actually truly fundamentally impossible. It cannot be done. And as mentioned in previous lectures, the mixing of cultures, the mixing of the Portuguese and native women eventually produces mestizos, which are half and half children, half black, half white children. And these children inherit the genetic protection of their mothers, and they usually are then taught Portuguese by their fathers. And so as time goes on throughout the 1460s, 1470s, we begin to have these half Portuguese, half African individuals who begin to be the bridges between these civilizations. Now, Portugal didn't just trade with the Africans. They also were trying to find places to put down roots. But obviously, coastal Africa was not going to work. So they were going to need to look elsewhere. And one of the places they looked were the islands that sat just off the coast of Africa. This is something that you might not know, and it's important to understand from my geography perspective. West Africa actually has a number of islands. In fact, the eastern half of the Atlantic has quite a few islands in general. In fact, I encourage you to look them up. Some of them include the Canary Islands, the Azores, the Cape Verde Islands, and a number of others. My personal favorite is St. Helena. That's where Napoleon got exiled, although to call that a North Atlantic island would be incorrect. It's in the South Atlantic, but still it's a pretty interesting place. But all of these islands have very different cultures, not cultures. They don't have cultures yet. They have very different climates from mainland Africa. And in fact, in the beginning, they didn't appear to have malaria. Malaria was the biggest problem for the Europeans. So what the Europeans did is they ended up colonizing these islands. They set up settlements and they began using them as trade posts. So they would send the goods to the islands, and the people on the islands would then take those goods and trade them in Africa. And basically what this did is it significantly cut the Portuguese mortality rate, and they were able to survive and not have the problems that they did when they lived on the mainland. As time goes on, though, these islands become diverse places as Africans get brought back from the coast, and these half African, half Portuguese begin to live on these islands. And we have very interesting, unique cultural things that begin to pop up there. Unfortunately, the development of these islands is also the introduction of large-scale African slavery. And the reason for this, unfortunately, is because the Portuguese also decided to take another thing that the Arab traders in the Middle East were doing and adapt it for themselves. The Portuguese saw one of the most valuable commodities that the Arabs or Muslim traders sold was sugar. And sugar is a very persnickety plant, sugarcane. It requires certain conditions to grow, and the Portuguese realized that they couldn't grow it in Portugal. In fact, I don't think the sugar cane grows anywhere in mainland Europe, but they realized that it did grow in many of the islands that they had just acquired off the coast of Africa. The problem is that the way to harvest sugar cane is extremely energy intensive. It's extremely time intensive, and it's actually dangerous. You have to hack down stalks with machetes, and this takes hours and hours and hours to do. And one bad swing of your machete might cause serious problems. And oftentimes the sugarcane fields were areas that were rife with bugs. And of course, bugs eventually have diseases, and diseases kill Europeans. And so these Portuguese landowners in these new colonies in these islands realized that they could not possibly supply the population required to deal with this problem. And so instead, they decided to go find a group of people that not only was readily available, but was largely resistant to the diseases that came with the sugarcane fields in all of these Atlantic islands. And of course, that was the African population. Now, oftentimes, I think there's a bit of a misnomer that the Europeans showing up caused African slavery. And of course, this is not the case. Not only was the Muslim world already very heavily involved in a slave trade with West Africa, but even before the Muslims had arrived, Africans had been taking each other as slaves for centuries. And by the way, this behavior is not unique to Africa, certainly, but it had been eliminated in Europe around the time of the Roman Empire. By the end of the Roman Empire, people being taken as slaves was uncommon. Now, don't ask about what were serfs in medieval peasants. Were they slaves? They certainly resembled slaves. They couldn't leave the land they lived on. But legally, anyway, there was a distinction between the serfs and the slaves. So Europe had had its own slave problem, but that was in the past. Unfortunately, many Europeans did not have any moral problems with slavery, especially of Africans, and we don't have time to get into the moral ambiguity or the moral lack of dilemma that these men saw. Obviously, slavery is immoral. Okay, there's no ambiguity there. But these people, the people that began buying slaves, apparently did not see it as a moral issue. And they began to buy African slaves in large numbers for these islands. Now, again, these islands, again, if you look them up on the map, are not large. And so the slave population required to grow sugarcane here was not intense or massive. And therefore, the impact on the slave trade of West Africa was relatively small. They simply started selling to the Portuguese in addition to the Muslims and to each other. By the way, West African slavery was a form of warfare and victory in warfare specifically. So when you defeated another tribe, you would take the men and the women and the children, and they would be part of your spoils. So not only would you take their stuff, but you would take them, and you would either keep them as slaves or you would sell them. And of course, if you just beat these guys in battle, you probably don't want them in your house. They'll shank you with a knife. And so you're probably going to sell them for other goods that you want. So this is very common, and people were taken as slaves, very common in West African society. This was not unusual, but what is eventually going to become unusual is the amount of slaves that the Portuguese buy. When they're only colonizing islands, they don't need many. But of course, if you do some quick math, the 1470s, 1480s, 1490s, this is when the slave trade begins in these Portuguese islands. What happens in 1492? Columbus discovers the Americas. And quickly in the 1490s and the 1500s and the 1510s, we have colonies for Spain and Portugal going up all over the New World. And these are not minor islands. These are huge islands or entire continents. And so soon, rather than just a trickle of African slaves into a few islands, almost 90% of African slaves are being exported to one location, the New World. And that is a story that we will save until the next lecture. Unfortunately, the Portuguese also continue to explore the African coast, and they're actually going to tap into another major resource when it comes to slaves, and that is the Congo. And by the way, I do want to point out that I'm spelling Congo with a K here because we're not talking about the Congo River, that's with a C, but we're talking about the Congo Empire, which is commonly in English spelled with a K to differentiate the two things. Portuguese traders in the 1480s make contact with the Congolese, and the River Congo has a really unique feature in that it has a waterfall very shortly after the ocean. And so you can't sail very far up with a Portuguese-style ship. Instead, you have to climb up the cliffs and enter this huge plateau full of rainforest where the Congolese Empire was. Effectively, this made the Congolese in a superior position to the Portuguese and forced the Portuguese to trade with them basically as equals. And they were more than willing to do this. The Portuguese began manufacturing weapons in their other colonies to sell to the Congolese. The Congolese used these weapons to defeat their enemies and sell them into slavery to the Portuguese. So we have this vicious cycle. For each slave taken, more guns enter the Congo, and the Congolese leaders are able to take more and more people as slaves. And this is unfortunate. I wish we had time to talk about the Congo, a very interesting culture. In fact, it's one of the first areas in southern Africa to convert to Christianity. The Congolese leaders converted to Christianity, but they continued the slave trade. Of course, that shouldn't surprise us, since clearly most people in the 15th and 16th century that were calling themselves Christians were fine with the slave trade. And hopefully as Christians today, we can say, yeah, that was wrong. So I guess it shouldn't surprise us that the Congolese continued to trade slaves even though they became Christians. Now, eventually, of course, the Portuguese do make it around the southern coast of Africa, and that's in 1488 with the voyage of Vasco da Gama. And Bartholomew Diaz in the 1490s eventually makes it all the way to India and back. And by the way, by doing this, they have basically cut the middleman out of that Asian trade that the Muslims had been doing. Suddenly, the Portuguese have direct access to the markets of the East, and they can sell European goods and buy Asian goods. And by the way, there's really a lot of funny stories about how the Asians are kind of insulted by European goods because the Europeans were really quite far behind compared to India and China. But that is unfortunately a story for another day. The important things to remember are this. Number one, the Portuguese effectively opened up a new segment of the world, and that was sub-Saharan Africa. And eventually they connected to existing parts of the World Trade Network, Asia and Europe. In addition to this, the Portuguese began the colonization process, and we can really attribute the Portuguese to the first overseas colonies in these islands that are off Africa. Finally, we can see the beginning of the slave trade, which will go on to eventually encompass many people in West Africa and in Southern Africa via the Congolese, and that is going to have a huge effect not only on Africa itself, but on the New World, North America and South America. That's all I have for you guys via lecture. In your worksheet today, you will have a little bit of research to do. I am assigning you the project of finding a Portuguese exploration, either an explorer or a colony, and writing several things about that colony or that explorer. So you guys will find that in the worksheet. Just know that you're going to have to do some outside research on that one this time. Again, because I think this is really interesting. At least it was very interesting to me to think about the experiences that these guys were having and the different things they were doing. So please be diligent on that. I think you'll learn a lot and enjoy that. Until next time,